kicking things off with Project Artichoke. This was a series of experiments carried out by the CIA beginning in 1951, exploring whether or not someone could be mentally controlled to the point of carrying out an action against their will. In a memo outlining the project in 1952, the main goal of the project was to apparently answer whether they could, quote, get control of an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will and even against fundamental laws of nature, such as self-preservation. Creepy. The tests were carried out in secret locations overseas throughout Europe, Japan, Southeast Asia, and the Philippines. Test subjects were given hallucinogenic substances, you can probably guess which, kept in total isolation for prolonged periods of time, and were subjected to hypnosis and psychological torment. Some experiments were also carried out on unwitting agents. Some were kept on hallucinogens for up to 77 days straight. That sounds like hell. So what exactly was the goal here? What were they attempting to actually have the test subjects do? Well, the end goal was for the hypnosis to work to the point where they could have control over an individual to such a point that they could command them to terminate prominent enemy politicians.
Next up on our list today we have Project QK-Hilltop, which was created to study Chinese brainwashing techniques in order to develop more effective methods of interrogation. It was actually a sub-project of MK Ultra carried out by the CIA, and it started in 1954. And it was spearheaded by Harold G. Wolff, if anyone cares. The experiment, which was carried out on prisoners of the Korean War, had 4 stages. The first was an assault on the individual's identity. For months, prisoners were physically and mentally tormented, all while being told they weren't actually the person that they thought they were. This was, of course, an attempt to break their sense of self along with their grasp on reality. The CIA then moved on to stage 2, attempting to convince the prisoners that they were the bad guys and making them feel guilt for their participation in the war. Stage 3, test subjects would begin to comply with the CIA's wishes, doubting their sense of self and agreeing that they had acted wrongly by engaging in the conflict and fighting against the United States rather than for the United States. And stage 4, the prisoners were given illicit substances so that the United States could test the effect of different substances on mood and corresponding levels of cooperation. Really, nothing good came of it, and if I'm being honest, it kind of seems like this whole thing was just some kind of weird psychotic fantasy that was played out under the guise of public safety. I'm just not buying it.
The Monster Study is one of the darkest psychological studies in American history. Many of the test subjects suffered from lifelong repercussions. This quote-unquote study was conducted in 1939 by Wendell Johnson and his graduate student Mary Tudor at the University of Iowa. The purpose was to investigate the effects of negative speech therapy on speech development. The researchers selected 22 orphans, some of which had stuttering problems, then divided them into 2 groups. One group received positive and encouraging speech therapy and feedback, while the other group received negative therapy. In the negative therapy group, the orphans were told that they had speech problems and were discouraged and belittled. And surprise, surprise, the negative therapy had some consequences. Some of the test subjects in this negative therapy group developed self-esteem issues and even developed speech problems, even though some of them didn't even have any before the study began. And a lot of them carried all this stuff into adulthood. And to top it all off, the subjects hadn't even been informed of the true nature of the study. They were told they'd be receiving regular speech therapy.
Next up we have the Aversion project. Much like the others, it's super messed up. In the 1970s and 80s, South Africa's segregated army forced many of their white, lesbian, and gay soldiers to undergo a sex change operation. Officials would actively seek out homosexuals in the armed forces and discreetly send them to unethical military psychiatric units with unethical military doctors who would attempt to turn the soldiers straight through the use of illicit substances, aversion, shock therapy, and hormone treatment. And if all that didn't work, soldiers would undergo either chemical castration if they were male or sex change operations if they were female. The majority of individuals who underwent the forced procedures were in their early 20s and had been forced into the army against their will. Many individuals died during the surgeries, and many others did not receive proper treatment after the surgeries were completed, leading to extreme complications complications in the healing process. The head of the operation, Dr. Aubrey Levin, moved to Canada, actually, and continued to practice psychiatry until he was sentenced to 5 years in prison on January 28th of 2013. It took that long. He was sentenced after violating a number of his patients. He since got out and he's living in a halfway house.
The Milgram experiment was a pretty fascinating one, but very unsettling. The experiment set out to test how far people would go against their own morals in order to follow authority, even when believing you could be causing someone physical harm. Yale University social psychology professor Stanley Milgram carried out the project in 1961. Participants were recruited to take part in what they believed was a study on learning and memory. They were assigned the role of teacher, while another person, who was secretly an actor, played the role of the learner. The teacher was instructed to administer electric shocks to the learner whenever they gave incorrect answers to a memory task. Now, the electric shocks weren't actually real. Again, the learner was an actor pretending to be in pain, but the experiment was designed to see if the teacher would continue to administer these increasingly severe shocks as ordered by the experimenter, despite all the screams of pain and terror coming from the learner. And the creepy part, even through the learner's screams and pleas to stop, a big majority of participants continued to administer shocks up to the highest level on the shock generator just because they were instructed to do so.
Next up, we have Harlow's Pit of Despair. You know that book, If You Give a Mouse a Cookie? It's kind of like that, but instead of giving a mouse a cookie, you take a monkey's mom away. I guess it's not really the same thing. Anyways, the experiment took place in the 1960s, and it was designed to better understand the effects of attachment on the development of young minds. In the experiment, infant monkeys were separated from their real mothers and were instead raised by wire mothers made of, well, wire, and cloth mothers made of cloth. The wire monkey had food and the cloth monkey was warm. The infantile monkeys, the real ones that were alive, always went for the cloth mother every time, except for, of course, mealtime, and that was the only time they ever went to the wire mother, was for food. In some variations of the experiment, the monkeys were placed in an isolation chamber for anywhere from a few days to as long as 10 weeks. Almost immediately, the monkeys would begin huddling in the corner and would remain motionless for the majority of their stay in the chambers. The monkeys in the experiment became so incapable of interacting with other monkeys that when it came time to mate, scientists would strap the affected monkeys down to a rack and have an unaffected monkey, you know. Anyways, the female monkeys who gave birth were unable to care for their young due to the extreme psychological torment they'd experienced throughout their lives. You might have heard of this in school, but I bet they didn't tell you all that. Or maybe they did. I only took Psych 101.
It's hard to imagine that something like World War II could really happen. How could an entire population follow one of the most tyrannical rulers in history? It's hard to wrap your head around it, and in order to teach his students firsthand, one teacher at Gubberley High School in California carried out a pretty disturbing experiment in 1967. One that could have easily gotten way out of hand if it had been allowed to go on any longer. He created a simulated totalitarian regime within the classroom with the motto strength through discipline, strength through community, strength through action, strength through pride. Originally, he'd only intended for this experiment to go on for one day, but he was fascinated with how quickly the students seemed to take to all these new strict rules. So he let it continue into the next day, and then the next and next. He implemented symbols of unity like a hand gesture resembling a certain salute, and encouraged students to report deviant behavior to him. Members began recruiting students from other classes, and the third wave movement, as Jones called it, which started with a class of like 30-something students, quickly became a 200 student strong movement, and things took a dark turn as this sense of unity and conformity led to discrimination, exclusion, and students suppressing each other's individual freedoms within the group. It had taken on this life of its own, and Jones decided he had to abruptly end the experiment only after 5 days before things completely spiraled out of control. Interesting experiment, gotta say, but definitely creepy.
Next up, we have the UCLA schizophrenia experiments. In 1983, research began at the university designed to better understand the signs of relapse in patients who suffered from schizophrenia. A large number of diagnosed schizophrenics taking preventative medications were brought in for the study. Researchers began reducing their medication to test the effect it would have on the mental state of their patients, and as you can probably guess, it didn't go well. Many patients quickly quickly began experiencing delusions, hallucinations, psychosis, paranoia, and insomnia, among other negative symptoms associated with schizophrenia. Not surprisingly, there were no procedures in place during the experiment that would protect the mental state of the patients, and despite the negative side effects growing each time medication was reduced, the reductions kept coming. The experiment lasted years until in 1991 a test subject by the name of Antonio Lamadrid threw himself off the roof of one of the UCLA buildings. A lawsuit found the university to be not responsible for Lamadrid's death. Wild, but it was concluded that the experiments were unethical and that they lacked informed consent, and so the project was terminated, as it should be.
And of course, MK Ultra. This was a top secret project carried out by the CIA during the 50s and 60s. It was pretty much the continuation of Project Artichoke. Its goal was to explore techniques for mind control and interrogation. MK Ultra used a wide range of experiments, including the use of illicit substances, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and psychological torment. The ultimate goal was to develop methods of influencing and then manipulating human behavior and extracting information through the use of psychology. The experiments were obviously highly unethical here, violating basic human rights. Participants included unwitting civilians, military personnel, and prisoners who were all subjected to extreme psychological and physical harm without their informed consent. They were administered mind-altering substances, leading to unpredictable and often traumatic experiences for the subjects involved. There was very little oversight or accountability here. Many documents related to the project were destroyed or classified as well, and the true extent of MK Ultra only came to light through investigations in the 70s.
And finally, we have the Stanford prison experiment. In 1971, an experiment was conducted in order to better understand the psychological implications of power dynamics. University students were recruited to play either guards or prisoners. The assignments were random, 12 prisoners, 12 guards, and then, without warning, those assigned prisoners were arrested, fingerprinted, blindfolded, and driven to a makeshift prison. There, they were stripped naked and instructed to change into prison uniforms. Subjects assigned the role of guards arrived at the prison and were given military-style uniforms, dark glasses, whistles, and clubs, and they were instructed to do whatever they believed was necessary in order to control those playing the role of inmates. On day one, confrontational behavior had already begun. Guards raided prison cells and woke inmates up in the middle of the night for attendance checks. By night two, the inmates had had enough, and so they barricaded themselves inside their cells. When the guards found out, they were not happy. They sprayed the inmates down with fire extinguishers, stripped them of their clothes, and took their beds. After that, the inmates became pretty submissive, but the guards only got more aggressive. The experiment was supposed to last for 2 weeks, but after just 5 days it ended due to the extreme behaviors that were taking place. Both the prisoners and the guards, surprisingly, suffered lasting trauma from the ordeal, experiencing flashbacks, severe anxiety, and some people even developed PTSD. Now, some of you may have seen the viral meme where a certain conspiracy theorist slams his hand on the table and loudly declares, "I'm sick of them putting chemicals in the water that turn the frickin' frogs gay." I'm not gonna say his name, but I'm sure many of you know who I'm talking about. Now, I know this man has said some incredibly offensive, insensitive, outlandish, and downright terrible things, but believe it or not, this particular theory might actually be true. Well, partly true that is. You see, in the early 2000s there was a study done that involved a pesticide by the name of Atrazine. That's Atrazine, because you just might want to know that information. The study also involved a group of African clawed frogs. Tadpoles raised in atrazine contaminated waters actually became hermaphrodites, developing both male and female reproductive organs. When adult male frogs were introduced into the waters, they stopped producing their male hormones and their reproductive organs became feminized. What's really scary is that the waters used in these experiments had atrazine levels as low as 0.1 parts per billion, which is 30 times lower than levels allowed in our drinking water. Atrazine is currently used in the United States, Canada, and Australia. Why? I have no clue. It really doesn't seem necessary or all that smart. Is this all some kind of strange government experiment? Maybe not, but Also probably yes. It's like super weird, and also just like don't use it, but okay.
Next on the list, we have the Nina Kulagina experiments. So Nina Kulagina was born in Russia in 1926, and from a very young age, she started to notice that objects seemed to move on their own around her, especially when she was angry. She grew up realizing that she had psychokinetic abilities, which she claimed to have inherited from her mother. She joined the Red Army at 14 years old in the tank regiment during World War II. And then after the war, the Soviet government took notice of her strange abilities and began performing experiments with her. There is footage of her performing some of her psychic abilities, making small objects move on their own, apparently just with her mind. She was even said to have stopped a frog's heart from beating during one of these sessions. Now, did she truly have special abilities? Was she just a simple charlatan? Not 100% certain, but what is certain is that the USSR was very interested in her during the Cold War, and according to some, they even set out to see if she could take out enemies just by using her mind.
Next on our list, we have Operation Red Hat, which involved accidentally releasing potentially harmful biological agents onto an unsuspecting public. The operation took place in 1971 and was conducted by a military testing facility in Utah. The purpose of the operation was to test various methods of disposal for chemical warfare agents. One of the methods involved burning the agents, including VX, which is an incredibly lethal nerve agent in open air pits. Yeah, you heard me. A room full of scientists, and no one thought to say maybe we shouldn't burn deadly chemicals in an open air pit. Okay. Of course, it was an incredibly bad idea, as the act allegedly led to the release of a variety of toxic chemicals into the atmosphere that wafted into nearby civilian populations and very negatively affected them. It's assumed that a large number of people became incredibly ill and even died as a result of inhaling the air contaminated with the toxic agents, but I could have told you that. They need to think a little more.
It's not just Russia that took an interest in someone with supposed special abilities, but the USA as well. Uri Geller is a much more well-known name than Nina Kulagina. This guy was kind of like the Chris Angel of the 70s, even appearing on talk shows like Johnny Carson. Geller is a self-proclaimed psychic and would also perform stuff like spoon bending. Now apparently there was also some less publicized stuff going on with him involving the CIA. This was the 70s, so the Cold War was still a thing. Not as tense as it had been in the 50s and 60s, but still present. So the CIA were very interested in the possibility of special abilities and if they'd be able to implement them into military operations. So they conducted a series of tests on Geller in 1973, focusing on his supposed clairvoyant abilities. In one of these experiments, scientists they did a test where they chose a random word from a dictionary while Geller was isolated in another room. He was supposed to draw what they'd picked without seeing or hearing them, of course. They picked the word fuse. Now strangely, apparently when Geller came out of his isolated room, having no way of knowing what word they'd chosen, he had sketched a picture of a firecracker.
Next up, we have Operation Big Buzz, which took place in 1955, and once again involved exposing the public to incredibly dangerous biological agents. Yay! In this case, it was yellow fever along with some other highly contagious diseases. Over 30,000 infected mosquitoes were released throughout several southeastern United States. While the mosquitoes were supposedly not infected with live pathogens of the diseases, the experiment was still deemed highly unethical by the general public, who had received no warning of the operation before it took place. So, what was the point of the government releasing hundreds of thousands of mosquitoes carrying allegedly deadly viruses onto the general public? Well, many people believe it was a test run designed to see just how effective the infected mosquitoes were at transmitting the various viruses to humans in a range of different environmental conditions, presumably to test how mosquitoes would perform as vessels for biological warfare agents.
Alright, next up, we have the occultism practices of the SS during World War II. So yeah, not only does the man who shall not be named, whose name starts with H, not only did he win the award for history's most evil man, but he's also one of the weirdest as well. He took things to comic book levels of villainy though, when he began having the Third Reich delve into the realm of the occult. Most of this was led by one of his right-hand men, Heinrich Himmler, who was very into occult stuff. They would seek out ancient artifacts that were believed to hold special powers. There were experiments done on psychokinesis. They'd perform dark rituals. One of the most famous locations they used for some of these rituals was Huska Castle in the Czech Republic, said to have been built over a bottomless pit to hell. Apparently they'd attempt to summon up demonic powers to aid in their crusade. It's absolutely insane. It's like Indiana Jones. It's just, yeah.
Next on the list we have HAARP. That's HAARP, the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program that controls the weather. Maybe. The HAARP uses powerful radio waves between 3 and 30 million hertz to heat ionospheric plasma. What is ionospheric plasma? Well, it's a mix of electrons, atomic and molecular ions, and neutral particles that exist within the ionosphere surrounding the Earth, which protects us from the sun's harmful UV rays and what can only be described as unpredictable space weather. With all that being said, I don't really think it's that far-fetched for people to believe that by manipulating and heating ionospheric plasma, the government is quite literally actively experimenting with it. Duh. Exploring the effects of changes to this layer in the Earth's atmosphere that directly relates to Earth temperature regulation, it's kinda weird. Is it getting hot in here, or is it just the government secretly experimenting? You tell me, but actually let me know in the comments because I do like to read them.
Alright, next on the list we have the Robert J. White experiments. Fair warning, things get kinda icky here, especially if you're an animal lover. For some reason in the 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s, there were a number of experiments done with animals that involved taking the head of one animal and then placing it on a different body, like Sid from Toy Story, and then seeing if the animal would live. This was done with dogs, frogs, monkeys, cats. Well, in 1970, the US government funded an experiment carried out by Robert J. White, where he transplanted the head of a monkey onto the body of another, and was actually successful. This new Franken monkey could hear, it could smell, it could taste, and it could even follow objects with its eyes for just over a week, and then it died.
Next up, we have that one time the United States government spent millions of taxpayer dollars trying to figure out the validity of psychic and paranormal phenomenon, which James has touched upon in 2 points already. But like, honestly, they could have saved a lot of money if they had just given James and I $500 each to spend a night on Poveglia Island, the most haunted island in Italy, and we could like telepathically tell them the ghosts that we saw. But that's another story. The main goal of the project was to determine whether or not a person could use psychic abilities to gather information about distant or hidden opposing operations. Many experiments were conducted to determine whether or not individuals were able to provide specific details regarding locations, objects, or events using only their minds. There are theories out there that claim that part of the experimentation involving paranormal research was geared towards psychic espionage, which again, James mentioned. Believe it or not, the project was ultimately considered a success, and while critics and skeptics continue to doubt the validity of psychic ability, it's actually not uncommon to see psychics working as valued members of the law, including CIA and FBI agents.
And finally, we have the secret experiments going on in Antarctica. Antarctica looks to be this mass of frozen wasteland, right? But for some reason, there are a number of government-run bases set up there, and while some of what goes on is disclosed to the public, there's other stuff that's a bit more mysterious. The United States and Russia are said to have set up secret research facilities in Antarctica to study alien technology and artifacts. These bases are equipped with advanced scientific equipment and are being run by elite scientists and military personnel. At least that's how the story goes. But some even claim that these facilities have made contact with extraterrestrials. So why Antarctica? Well, Antarctica is said to be a hotspot for UFOs, first of all. And it does sound pretty far-fetched, But if aliens really were visiting Earth but wanted to stay out of sight, Antarctica would be a pretty prime spot. There are no permanent residents, and it's vast. So the idea of there being leftover alien technology buried under ice that scientists are researching or reverse engineering still sounds completely nuts, but you never really know, right?
Coming in at number 10 is Parallel Universe. A group of NASA scientists working on an experiment in Antarctica have detected evidence of a parallel universe where the rules of physics are opposite of our own, according to a report. A cosmic ray detection experiment has found particles that could be from a parallel realm that was also born in the Big Bang. Now, the expert used a giant balloon to carry NASA's Antarctic Impulsive Transient Antenna, or ANITA, high above Antarctica, where the frigid dry air provided the perfect environment with little to no radio noise to distort its findings. Now, a constant wind of high energy particles constantly arrives on Earth from outer space. That means the high energy particles can only be detected coming down from space, but the team's ANITA detected heavier particles, so-called tow neutrinos, which come up out of the Earth. Now, the finding implies that these particles are actually traveling backward in time, suggesting evidence of a parallel universe. The simplest explanation for the phenomenon is that at the moment of the Big Bang, 13.8 billion years ago, two universes were formed, ours and the one that from our perspective is running in reverse with time going backwards. We're left with the most exciting or most boring possibilities, said Ibrahim Safa, who worked on the experiment. Number 9. Million-year-old DNA. In the fall 2022, scientists announced that they uncovered million-year-old DNA just north of the continent of Antarctica. Yeah, a million years old. Now, scientists actually accidentally collected the unusual genetic samples up to 584 feet beneath the seafloor as part of a 2019 survey led by the International Ocean Discovery Program in the Scotia Sea north of mainland Antarctica. The ancient sediment that was discovered is now the oldest marine DNA found from seafloor sediments. The team looked closely at damage patterns within the recovered DNA fragments to establish exactly how old they were. Now, the oldest fragments clocked in at around 1 million years old. Now, until now, the oldest CETA DNA, which was found locked inside Arctic permafrost, dated to around 650,000 years ago. Now, this DNA will be analyzed and studied by scientists, as it will tell us a lot about the polar marine ecosystem, as well as how climate change may affect Antarctica. Number 8. Earthquake swarms. A series of earthquakes was recently discovered all the way in Antarctica, the southernmost continent. Now, scientists discovered earthquake swarms occurred along the Shetland Plate and the Antarctic Plate. Now, the swarms lasted from August 2020 all the way through February 2021. Within that time, around 85,000 earthquakes occurred, which is insane and low-key scary. Scientists believe this series of earthquake storms were caused by the eruption of a dormant volcano. Now, the swarm occurred around the Orca Seamount, an inactive volcano that rises 2,950 feet from the seafloor in the Bransfield Strait. Now, the two largest earthquakes in the series were a magnitude of 5.9 quake in October 2020 and a magnitude 6.0 quake in November. Number 7. Colossal Squid Expedition. An international expedition of scientists conducted a colossal squid exploration in December 2022 and were able to grab videos and photos of some of the rare species swimming far beneath the surface. Now, this type of squid is the largest invertebrate in the world, and this expedition could reveal important information about the behaviors and habits of the colossal squids, as well as information on animal life in Antarctica in general. Now, this species was first discovered in 1925, so the goal of the scientists was to capture footage of this majestic creature before the 100-year anniversary of its discovery. Now, while this discovery in Antarctica is still underway, there is much more we can learn about these creatures. Number 6. Meteorite. In January this year, on an excursion to the icy plains of Antarctica, an international team of researchers discovered 5 new meteorites, including one of the largest ever found on the continent. Now, the rare meteorite is about the size of a cantaloupe, but weighs a hefty 17 pounds. The specimen is one of only about 100 that size or larger discovered in Antarctica, a prime meteorite hunting location where more than 45,000 space rocks have been tracked down. Now, the exceptional find is heading to the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences in Brussels, where it can be studied. Maria Valdez, a research scientist at Chicago's Field Museum of Natural History and the University of Chicago, who is part of the expedition team, has kept some of the material for her own analysis. She'll take her samples and use strong acids to dissolve them before a process called calibrated chemistry to isolate various elements that make up the rock. Then I can start to think about the origin of this rock, how it evolved over time, what kind of parent body it came from, and where in the solar system the parent body formed, she said. These are the kind of big questions that we try to address. Number 5. Strange creatures. In 2021, geologist James Smith of the British Antarctic Survey drilled through an Antarctic ice shelf to sample sediment which was locked under half a mile of ice. To get to it, James and his colleagues had to melt 20 tons of snow to create 20,000 liters of hot water, which they then pumped through a pipe lowered down a borehole. Next, they lowered an instrument to collect the sediment along with a GoPro camera. Later that night in his tent, James watched the footage and he found a rock 4,600 feet under the surface. Now, it was the wrong place for collecting seafloor muck, but the absolute right place for a 1 in a million shot of finding life in an environment that scientists didn't think could support that much of it. A layer of bacteria known as microbial mat was on the rock. An alien-like sponge and other stalked animals dangled from the rock, while stoder cylindrical sponges hugged at the surface. The rock was also lined with wispy filaments, perhaps a component of the bacterial mats, or perhaps a particular animal known as a hydroid. Now, whatever the case, this was an extraordinary find that they will be continuing to study. Number 4. Deepest Point Mapped. A new map of the Southern Ocean gave scientists their most detailed view to date of the seafloor surrounding Antarctica, including its deepest point, the Factorian Deep. Resting at a depth of around 24,400 feet below sea surface, or 17 Empire State Buildings stacked top to bottom, the Factorian Deep was only discovered in 2019. But until now, researchers had no idea how it fit together with the surrounding seafloor. The new map draws from more than 1,200 sonar data sets collected mostly by science vessels and covers more than 18.5 million square miles of the sea floor. Researchers hope to use the sea bottom chart to identify underwater mountains or seamounts that might be hotspots for marine life. Number 3. Blood Falls. In the McMurdo Dry Valley, a bright crimson 5-story waterfall pours out of Taylor Glacier into Lake Bonny. It looks like a gush of blood from a wound in the ice, but scientists have recently discovered the cause behind this mysterious phenomenon. The water that feeds Blood Falls was once a salty lake that is now cut off from the atmosphere due to the formation of glaciers on top of the lake. Now, the water is preserved 400 meters underground and has become even saltier over time. It's now 3 times saltier than seawater and cannot freeze. The salt water is also extremely rich in iron and completely devoid of oxygen and sunlight. As the iron-rich water seeps through a fissure in the glacier and comes to contact with the air, the iron oxidizes and rusts, staining the water a dark red color. Now, just looking at this freaks me out, but I'm glad scientists were able to discover the reason behind it. Number 2. Singing ice. It appears that a massive slab of ice in Antarctica is singing. The Ross Ice Shelf is the largest ice shelf in Antarctica. It's several hundred meters thick and covers an area of over 500,000 square kilometers, around the size of France. Scientists have recently discovered that the Ross Ice Shelf sings an eerie melody caused by the winds blowing across the snow dunes. The winds create surface vibrations and almost non-stop seismic tones. Now, the vibrations aren't audible to human ears, and scientists use seismic sensors to hear the tune. Now, the song was actually discovered by accident after seismic sensors were installed on the ice shelf to observe other behaviors. Now, scientists have since discovered that the song changes in response to the environment, such as melting or storms shifting the snow. They're now using the song as a tool to monitor the ice shelf in real time, tracking its stability and vulnerability for collapse through the seismic humming. And coming in number 1 is secret lakes. It's difficult to imagine anything beneath the thick layers of ice in Antarctica, yet scientists have discovered a number of underground lakes. First uncovered in 1970 with radars, there are estimated to be around 400 lakes sitting under 3 kilometers of ice. Scientists believe the lakes were formed after the separation of Antarctica from Gondwanaland, the ancient supercontinent. Lake Vostok, discovered in the 1990s by Russian scientists, is the largest subglacial lake in Antarctica. In 2014, scientists had a major breakthrough at Lake Wallens, discovering a diverse and active ecosystem of microorganisms in the lake, nearly a kilometer under an ice sheet. Then in 2022, researchers discovered a city-sized lake hidden deep underneath the East Antarctic ice sheet. The hidden lake, which was named Lake Snow Eagle, has a surface area of 143 square miles and lies in a mile-deep canyon beneath 2 miles of ice. The team uncovered the lake following 3 years of exhaustive aerial surveys over the ice sheet, using radar and special sensors designed to measure minuscule changes in Earth's gravity. Now, experts believe it could contain 34-million-year-old river sediments that are older than the ice sheet itself, and could shed light on what Antarctica was like before the continent froze.
Kicking off the list at number 10, the aviator suit. When it comes to new ideas and new inventions, it almost seems messy at first, all the time. It's always a horrible start. And today's list is quite messy, a lot of horrible experiments done with groups of unaware subjects. To kick this grim one off, we'll look back to the early 1900s. We'll start with Franz Reichelt, a known inventor of the time. He invented his own version of a wearable aviator suit. It was a parachute. It was made of 320 square feet of fabric. It wasn't light at all. And in 1912, Franz wanted to test this new invention out in public, but instead of using a dummy and throwing that off the Eiffel Tower, Franz wanted to be brave and he strapped himself in. And the rest is history. Dark, horrible fast history. Number 9. The Hoffling Hospital Experiment. This experiment happened all the way back in 1966, so a bit more recent, in a time where the rules of psychological experiments, well, didn't really exist. Really. I was gonna say they were kind of loose, but no, they were not really a thing at all. Because of this, the nurses that were all part of this experiment had no idea that they were participants, which nowadays is totally illegal, very illegal. The night nurse would receive a phone call during the shift, and on the other end would be Dr. Smith, who's actually the researcher in this scenario. He would ask the nurses to check the medical cabinet to see if they had a drug called Astrotin, which was actually a drug that was made up for this experiment, and it was actually just a placebo, so don't worry too much. The Astrogen would clearly state the maximum dosage of 10 milligrams, but Dr. Smith would ask the nurses to administer 20 milligrams. They were told that the doctor was in a hurry and he would sign the papers later and all that jazz. This just had to get done that night. This had to be delivered to the patient ASAP. If the nurse decided to give the patient the drug, they would be breaking 3 rules. They're not allowed to accept instructions over the phone, the dose was double the maximum limit stated on the box, and the medicine itself was unauthorized. Big 2. And it was not on the ward stock list, so it shouldn't be used in the hospital in the first place. Big 3 red flags right there. Out of the 22 unknowing nurse participants, 21 of them went to administer this. Yeah, big oof on that one. Yikes. To be fair, that's the entire point of this test. This is nothing towards the nurses. I'm not ripping on them at all. I mean, this was 1966. We didn't know quite a bit back in the day, you know what I mean? This really showed the pressure nurses are put under randomly in the middle of the night, if anything. Number 7. Psychic driving. British psychiatrist Donald Ewan Cameron is to blame for this one. Remember that name. Don't listen to anything he says. He created the psychic driving concept that the CIA found interesting, to say the least. Basically, psychic driving was a procedure that subjects patients to a continuous, repeated audio loop of something that's intended to change their behavior. Just the same line or the same whatever over and over thousands of times. And through the course of their treatment, they would also be paralyzed while being exposed to the loop message. Yeah, the worst thing ever, right? So the CIA heard about this and started sending money to fund Cameron's experiments, but he actually didn't know it was coming from the CIA because they used a fake name. Classic CIA. Cameron would subject patients to paralytics and electroconvulsive therapy, stronger than usual as well, just to make things worse, just at a horrible limit. The experiments were mostly conducted on patients who entered the institute for more common problems like anxiety disorders or postpartum depression, and ended up leaving with permanent effects from his actions. These included things like amnesia, being unable to speak. Some people forgot their parents' names and thought that the interrogators were actually their real parents. Just horrible things. Their minds were just so confused. Brutal stuff. Number 6, Go pills. Here in Toronto, we have Go trains, Go buses, but not Go pills. Not yet. Hopefully not ever, actually. Yeah, move over 5-hour energy. We got some competition on the horizon. Staying awake is challenging, even when you're doing something you absolutely enjoy, like watching a movie. You'll still fall asleep. It just happens, we're human. My dad fell asleep in a theater once in the moving chairs. I couldn't believe it. Guy's 3D glasses were falling off of his face. I was in shock. But he works a lot. He works crazy hours, he's older. That's where Go pills were supposed to come in handy. Workers who have these long shifts and work late hours to pay the bills. This pill was supposed to keep you up for 40 hours straight. So a bit much, I'd say. The US Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, or DARPA, which is much less air coming out of my mouth, is currently funding this pill. But what if it's mistreated? I can't even begin to imagine the negative effects something like this could have on people. We could barely handle Tide Pods as a community. You know what I mean? It's kind of a bad idea, I vote. Number 5. The Milgram experiment. When learning about our past in further detail, like the Trinity test for example, and how that led to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it's important to understand why these things happened and why these people did this, or more so how people are influenced into doing these horrible things historically, especially in large numbers. So the Milgram experiment was put in place to get an idea. How far will people go when it comes to obeying instructions, specifically if it involves a third party being hurt? Well, Stanley Milgram, Yale psychologist, created this test. There's 3 important roles for this one. You need the teacher, the experimenter, and the learner. The learner is disguised as the main test subject, but really, they're actually in on the whole thing. The real subject is over here. The teacher, the one administering pain to the test subjects. So they're told by this higher figure, whoever, to keep upping the pain every time they get a question wrong. They're like the rule maker. So the real test here is to see how far humans will go when hurting others under direct authority. It's important to note that the subject also isn't actually getting shocked at all. Again, they're in on it. They play it up. They play it up more and more just to see what's going on. These tests were underway in 1961 in a basement at Yale University. In college, I did improv. That's wild. That's a wild after-school curricular activity. Number 4, Unit 731. The Imperial Japanese Army's Unit 731 conducted some pretty horrible experiments during World War II that certainly are going to shock anyone who learns about them. This is wild. This definitely belongs on this list. The experiments were meant to be done as a way to prepare for biological warfare, but the process was horrible and extremely inhumane, as are most of these things. Different medical schools and universities all provided doctors and other research staff to help conduct these experiments. Big group effort, nice, way to go guys. They used both prisoners and civilians as test subjects. There were a bunch of different experiments that were conducted during this time, some of which involved injecting them with pathogens like cholera or anthrax, or operations with just no anesthesia, just weapon testing, all painful stuff, really the worst of the worst. And finally, coming in number 1, facial expressions experiment. Yep, a wild one to close her off. The facial expressions experiment. Okay, back in 1924, a psychologist with, you guessed it, the University of Minnesota, classic university stuff, he wanted to conduct an experiment to study facial expressions, right? Sounds pretty harmless so far, dare I say, sounds a little silly. More specifically, he wanted to see if everyone's expressions of emotions were all the exact same. Does happiness look the same on everybody? Does sadness? What about fear or shock, disgust, anger? What about those? So he recruited some volunteers from campus and then painted the lines of their facial muscles black. And then he exposed each participant to different stimuli in order to photograph their reactions. He wanted to compare all these results side by side. The stimuli at hand was intense. This guy wanted big reactions. He included showing them adult films, he exposed them to ammonia, he made them touch reptiles, and of course horrible things that I can't talk about here on the tube of you. You know what I mean? Horrible, horrible stuff. All in the name of facial expressions. What an awful experiment. What a dark one.
Number 9, the human vivisections of Herophilus. Ancient physician Herophilus is considered the father of anatomy. And while he made significant discoveries during his practice, it's how he learned about internal workings of the human body that lands him on this list. Herophilus practiced medicine in Alexandria, Egypt, and for at least about 30 to 40 years, he was allowed to dissect human bodies, which he did publicly, along with contemporary Greek physician and autonomous Aristratus. Under the laws of the time, criminals could be sentenced to dissection and vivisection as a punishment, and it's said the father of anatomy not only dissected the dead, but also performed vivisections on an estimated 600 living prisoners. Now, Herophilus made great strides in the study of human anatomy, especially the brain, eyes, liver, circulatory system, nervous system, and reproductive system during a time in history when dissecting human cadavers was considered an act of discretion of the body. And like today, performing vivisections on living bodies was considered butchery, but at the time it was allowed, and he sure did capitalize off of it. Number 8. The Boston Project. Working with the Oak Ridge National Laboratory from 1953 to 57, Dr. William Sweet, who was the chief neurosurgeon at Harvard's Massachusetts General Hospital, gave uranium injections to 11 cancer patients who were terminally ill, with all but one reportedly suffering from brain tumors. Dr. Sweet was interested in learning how the distribution of uranium affected the body and whether it could be used to treat tumors. In 1995, under testimony, Dr. Sweet claimed that he had consent from his patients for his experiments. However, a lack of supporting documents, as well as the case of one patient who was found unconscious and later died without regaining consciousness or being identified, makes those claims slightly dubious. Number 7. The father of gynecology. Throughout the 1840s, J. Marion Sims, who is often referred to as the father of gynecology, performed surgical experiments on enslaved African women without anesthesia. The women, one of whom was operated on 30 times, suffered from infections and many failed surgeries before they were finally cured. The period which Sims operated on enslaved women between 1845 and 1849 was one of which new practice of anesthesia was not universally accepted as safe and effective. It has also been claimed that he addicted the women in his surgical experiments to morphine, only providing the drugs after the surgery was already completed to make them more compliant. Number 6. The Stateville Penitentiary Malaria Study. The Stateville Penitentiary Malaria Study was a controlled study of the effects of malaria on prisoners of Stateville Penitentiary near Joliet, Illinois, beginning in the 1940s. The study was conducted by the Department of Medicine, now the Pritzker School of Medicine, at the University of Chicago, in conjunction with the United States Army and the U.S. State Department. At the Nuremberg trials, German doctors cited the precedent of the malaria experiments as part of their defense. The study continued at the Stateville Penitentiary for 29 years. In related studies from 1944 to 1946, Dr. Alf Alvring, a nephrologist and professor at the University of Chicago Medical School, purposely infected psychiatric patients at the Illinois State Hospital with malaria so that he could test experimental treatments on them. Number 5. The Guatemala Study. In a 1946 to 1948 study in Guatemala, U.S. researchers used prostitutes to infect prison inmates, insane asylum patients, and Guatemalan soldiers with syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases to test the effectiveness of penicillin in treating STDs. They later tried infecting people with direct inoculations made from syphilis bacteria poured into the men's private parts and on forearms and faces that were slightly abraded, or in a few cases through spinal punctures. Approximately 700 people were infected as part of the study. The study was sponsored by the Public Health Service, the National Institute of Health, the Pan American Healthy Sanitary Bureau, now the World Health Organization, Pan's American Health Organization, and the Guatemalan government. Now, the team was led by John Charles Cutler, who later participated in the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. Cutler chose to do the study in Guatemala because he would not have been permitted to do it in the United States. In 2012, when the research was revealed, the U.S. officially apologized to Guatemala for the studies. A lawsuit has been launched against Johns Hopkins University, Bristol Myers Squibb, and the Rockefeller Foundation for alleged involvement in the study. Number 4. The Holmesburg Prison Studies. From approximately 1951 to 1974, the Holmesburg Prison in Pennsylvania was the site of extensive dermatological research operations using prisoners as subjects. Led by Dr. Albert M. Kilman of the University of Pennsylvania, the study was performed on behalf of Dow Chemical Company, the U.S. Army, and Johnson & Johnson. Dow Chemical wanted to study the health effects of dioxin and other herbicides to discover how they affect human skin, because workers at its chemical plants were developing chloracne. In the study, Kilman applied about the same amount of dioxin as to which the Dow employees were being exposed. In 1980 and 1981, some of the people who were used in the study sued Kilman because they were suffering from a variety of health problems, including lupus and psychological damage. Kilman later continued his dioxin studies, increasing the dosage of dioxin, which he applied again of 10 prisoners, to 7,500 micrograms of dioxin, which is 468 times the dosage of the Dow Chemical official Gerald K. Rowe had authorized him to administer. Now, as a result, the prisoners developed inflammatory pustules and papules, and the Holmesburg program paid hundreds of inmates to test a wide range of cosmetic products and chemical compounds whose health effects were unknown at the time. A 1964 issue of Medical News News reported that 9 out of 10 prisoners at Holmesburg Prison were medical test subjects. Number 2. Mustard gas tested on American military. Mustard gas is a type of chemical warfare agent, and as a chemical weapon, mustard gas was first used in World War I. In 1943, the US Navy exposed its own sailors to mustard gas. Now, officially, the Navy was testing the effectiveness of the new clothing and gas masks against the deadly gas that had proven so terrifying in the First World War. But the worst of the experiments occurred at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington. Young men were approached after 8 weeks of boot camp and asked if they wanted to participate in an experiment that would help shorten the war. Now, obviously, they said yes, but they didn't know what they were signing up for. Only when the boys reached the research laboratory were they told the experiment involved mustard gas. In 2015, Rollins Edwards, a soldier, spoke out about going through this experiment. He said, "It felt like you were on fire, guys started screaming and hollering and trying to break out, and then some of the guys fainted. And finally, they opened the door and let us out, and the guys were they were in bad shape." Now, the participants, almost all of whom suffered several external and internal burns, were ignored by the Navy, and in some cases threatened with the Espionage Act. In 1991, the reports were finally declassified and taken before Congress.
Number 10. Stubbins Firth. When the yellow fever epidemic broke out in Pennsylvania, the University of Pennsylvania was conscripted to help find a cure. One of their many prestigious doctors was a man by the name of Stubbins Firth, and this man had a mission. He was determined to understand the root cause of the disease, and nothing would stop him from ensuring that this evil was defeated. Firth theorized that yellow fever was not a contagious disease, but instead related to the heat of the summer. To prove this, Firth decided that he would perform an experiment with himself as the subject. Firth then smeared himself in the bodily waste of patients infected with yellow fever, rubbing it into cuts on his arms, pouring it in his eyes, frying it and inhaling the fumes, and when that all didn't work, he just ate it. And well, he didn't catch the disease. However, it didn't actually end up proving anything about the disease, as the samples had come from already recovered patients. Years later, after his death, Cuban scientist Carlos Finlay would then correctly attribute the root of the disease to mosquitoes. Number 9. Paracelsus, a deeply important figure to the world of medicine. Paracelsus was a Swiss doctor, philosopher, and just general weirdo. One of the key figures during the German Renaissance, he's known as the father of toxicology and a practitioner of Hermeticism, wandering around the world before eventually taking up residency in Germany and teaching from the University of Basel. He was reportedly quite unstable, frequently under the influence of spirits, refusing to accept conventional medicine, and outright burning books he didn't like in protest, and just, generally being a little freak. He claimed, get ready for this one, that it was possible to grow a man by fermenting sperm inside of a jar of horse dung, an experiment which he carried an example of with wherever he went. Number 8. Jose Delgado. Alright, everyone else on this list is pretty evil. The last two were just, kind of funny. Jose Delgado was a Spanish doctor who worked out of Yale University. His research, on the other hand, was deeply disturbing. The neurologist's primary interest focused around the stimulation of responses in the brain using electricity, which he hoped to be able to use to force the brain to produce the thoughts and emotions that he wanted. In other words, actual mind control. And if that isn't terrifying enough, he also ran experiments on anyone he could find, which usually ended up being people who were either schizophrenic or epileptic. One of his more famous experiments was the one where he used a remote control device to make a bull stop its charge. Number 7. Robert Liston. Liston is an infamous surgeon who worked in the Victorian era. He quickly earned a reputation for being the fastest knife in the West End, and being able to amputate a leg in 2.5 minutes. That did happen, by the way, and the patient died of gangrene. He also amputated one of his assistant's fingers for some reason, and they also died of gangrene. Oh, and then, for some inexplicable reason, he lashed out at a surgical spectator who died from shock. What? Either way, Liston was also known as the first surgeon to use anesthesia in Europe, so... Wait, no, what? Number 6. Giovanni Aldini. If you don't know this guy, you'll know who he inspired. An Italian physician, Aldini worked primarily in the application of galvanism to the medical profession, which was the study of passing electricity through the nervous system to induce movement. His most famous experiment was in how he stimulated movement in the body of an executed criminal in London, which was recorded by the Newgate Calendar. Quote, "On the first application of the process to the face, the jaws of the deceased criminal began to quiver, and the adjoining muscles were horribly contorted, and one eye actually opened." The report goes on to describe how the legs and hands were moved as well. A fearful visage for any bystander. Number 5. Andrew Ure. But this inspiration didn't just stop with Aldini. Where the Italian walk, Ure sprinted. Working as a professor of natural philosophy, Ure would establish himself as a well-respected scientist, with a wide variety of focuses that he could claim mastery over. However, when Ure was approached by his friend and professor of anatomy, James Jeffrey, to aid in an experiment, Ure's writings on what happened next would catapult him into fame. Jeffrey had been working on a similar experiment to Aldini's, using the body of a criminal as a test subject and stimulating movement through the phrenic nerve. In 1819, Ure would record an incident where Jeffrey would display his discovery to the public, first moving limbs, then stimulating the eyes to open, and finally causing the contortions of muscles in the face to create terrifying expressions. Members of the crowd reportedly sprinted from the room in horror, and one man was even recorded to have fainted. Number 4. Robert Nelson. One of the stranger entries on this list, Nelson's experiments could be argued as something between evil and just misguided. As it turns out, that division is pretty hard to define, as Bob Nelson's ultimate end goal was the ability to resurrect anyone. Starting as a TV repairman, Nelson would partner with an actual doctor by the name of Dante Brunel, and they would begin to develop a machine to preserve people in an early form of cryostasis. Putting out a call for subjects, they found themselves with an offer from James Bedford, a professor dying of kidney cancer which had metastatized into his lungs. As Bedford passed through legal death, Nelson and Brunel went about preserving his body with the hopes that he could be resurrected when the cure for cancer was discovered. Pumping his blood full of antifreeze, they stored the body in Alcor, the first of what would later number in the hundreds. Number 3. Robert G. Heath. This scumbag was a psychiatrist working out of Louisiana, with his primary study being deep brain stimulation, or DBS. Heath proposed that through DBS he was capable of influencing anyone to be able to change their mind, and thus he could cure mental illness through electrical stimulation. His claims were absurd, stating that he had successfully managed to give patients schizophrenia through blood transfusions and electrical shocks. As most of those patients died, it was fairly difficult to confirm this. He also claimed to find the cure for being gay. He claimed that he'd managed to quote-unquote cure a patient of being gay, since that was actually considered a mental illness at the time. It's also implied that he had an involvement with the project MK-Ultra, though this remains unconfirmed, but extremely plausible. Number 2. Ilya Ivanov. A Russian scientist, if you couldn't tell immediately, Ivanov was a particularly strange scientist. The majority of his experiments revolving around two things. The first was the perfection of the method in which artificial insemination was done, which allowed for easier access to the technology, which was primarily used by horse breeders. His second interest was weirder. Ivanov apparently was extremely interested in creating a human-ape hybrid. Fortunately, he only attempted to do this through artificial insemination. Ivanov failed to create a pregnancy, but his legacy lives on as one of the most odd experiments ever conceived. Like, just why? Number 1. Shiro Ishii. There's not much to say about this man, and at the same time, there is so much more that needs to be said. Ishii was the Surgeon General of Unit 731, the perpetrator of one of the most notorious and vile series of experiments the world has ever witnessed. Some of these included infecting subjects with the plague, using live subjects for weapons testing, forced pregnancies, vivisections on live and aware subjects, and the induction of frostbite on live subjects. When Japan surrendered, he attempted to destroy the files that would indict him but failed. Didn't matter either way, as he was granted war crime immunity by the US government and later employed by them to advise on bioweapons. I'm not joking. This man is a monster, did monstrous things, and got away with it scot-free. The Japanese government has not taken responsibility for the actions of Unit 731.
In our number 10 spot, we have the hepatitis outbreak. Allegedly, in the 50s, there was a New York State-run institution for mentally handicapped young ones called Willowbrook State School, and it unfortunately was known for its uncleanliness, and as a result, the school had an outbreak of hepatitis. A doctor got wind of what was going on in that school, and he created an experiment that would assist in developing a vaccine. The only problem is the experiment would involve deliberately infecting the young ones with the disease. Horrible. His name was Dr. Sewell Krugman. The experiment received a lot of attention from the media, but the parents signed permission slips, so people let it go, unfortunately. However, apparently it was very hard to get into this school, so some think that parents felt that they had to sign these forms and allow it in order to keep their kid there. I can imagine that in the 50s there wasn't a lot of options, so that's truly sad, especially hearing that their only option was an extremely dirty school. In our number 9 spot, we have nuclear testing. In 1954, the US government started performing nuclear tests near the Marshall Islands in the Pacific Ocean. The US was performing a series of nuclear tests that they called Castle Bravo, and these tests unfortunately resulted in a yield larger than anticipated. This then led the government to create Project 4.1, where they decided to study how the humans, the Marshallese nearby, were affected by the explosion. Some believe that the explosion and its impact was all an accident, but some believe that the US government planned this so that they could study and see how these people would be affected. Many of the Marshallese people had radiation poisoning, and of course, as you can imagine, many developed cancer that is believed to be associated with the explosion. Beta burns were also seen after the incident. In our number 8 spot, we have electroshock therapy. Some of these experiments quite possibly could have been done by people that believe that they are doing some good, but they themselves are insane. Either that or they are evil, because to experiment on young ones in any way is truly sickening. Here we have a doctor in the 1960s named Dr. Loretta Bender, who worked at New York's Creedmoor Hospital, and she began a treatment that she believed to be a revolutionary treatment for kids with social issues. It was electroshock therapy. She would interview and analyze a young one in front of a large group of people, and she would apply pressure to their heads. Apparently, the people who would move were considered to have shown early signs of schizophrenia. It was said that she was not sympathetic to the young patients, and that in her time she used this electroshock therapy on over 100 young ones. It is unknown how these young ones were affected long term. In our number 7 spot, we have the stuttering experiment. Here we have yet another experiment that makes my blood boil. I'll get to why in a bit. This test took place in 1939 by Wendell Johnson and Mary Tudor, and the purpose of this test was to analyze the psychology around why people stutter and or how it can be cured. These researchers experimented on 22 young orphans and separated them into 2 groups. One group got praise for how they spoke, and the other group got negative feedback. The group that got negative feedback had normal speaking orphans suddenly begin to develop speech problems that apparently they had for the rest of their lives. I myself have struggled with speaking in my past, and that is why I actually started pushing myself to be in front of the camera and practice. So it's definitely hard to hear about experiments like this that could truly make or break the confidence of a young person. So gross. In our number 6 spot, we have the prison transplants. From 1913 to 1951, there was a surgeon doctor at California's San Quentin prison by the name of Dr. Leo Stanley, who obviously had access to many patients in the prison, and so he began to start testing on them. The experiments would range from sterilization to potential treatments for the Spanish flu to performing transplant surgeries. The transplant surgeries would actually be testicle transplants using testicles of executed prisoners, and sometimes from animals like goats, for example. Yeah, that is truly horrific and definitely evil, and arguably he should have been in this prison. Isn't it weird how many horrible prison guard or prison doctor stories there are out there about them mistreating the inmates? Something that I'm sure a lot of prisoners were imprisoned for. Makes you think. In our number 3 spot, we have the mosquito experiment. How more people don't know about these experiments is truly beyond me. This one is deeply shocking to hear, so brace yourself. In 1956 and 1957, the US Army, aka the government because it would have had to have been approved, conducted a series of experiments on Florida, Georgia, and Savannah where they released millions of infected mosquitoes in order to see if insects could spread yellow fever. Of course, they learned that yes, they can, as many people contracted fevers, serious respiratory problems, stillbirths, typhoid, and much more. Apparently, to take it another step further, in order to get photo evidence of the experiment, researchers acted as health workers so they could see the patients. Many died from this experiment, as you can imagine. I wonder if there are any long-term effects for the people in these areas. I guess that's info I'm sure we'll never know. It's probably kept in top secret places like Area 51, let's be real. In our number 2 spot, we have Korean experimentation. Allegedly, there have been a ton of North Korean experiments over the years on prisoners. One experiment that has been spoken about was one where 50 female prisoners, all of good health, were given poisoned cabbage leaves. Apparently, within the hour, all had died. Allegedly, they also do experimental surgeries without anesthesia, starve them, and at times gas entire families. It is rumored that there is a van called the Crow where people are taken every month for these experiments. I truly hope that this is something from the past, but I know that there will always be evil in the world as much as we all wish there wasn't, so I wouldn't be surprised to hear that this is possibly something that still happens, and I truly hope it isn't. In our number 1 spot, we have Navy volunteers. In 1943, young men who were in the Navy were basically tricked into volunteering themselves to be gassed. This happened in the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington in the US. They were told that this experiment might help shorten the war, and so of course they wanted to do their duty and help. They were exposed to mustard gas, which of course was a deadly gas that was actively used in World War I. They were only told what they were participating in once the experiment was about to start. All of the soldiers suffered severe external and internal burns. All of the people were allegedly silenced and threatened by the Navy, and it wasn't until the 90s, when the documents were declassified, was this experiment taken to Congress.
Number 9. The Neubauer separations. Peter Neubauer was a child psychiatrist who immigrated to the US in 1941 from Austria. Initially taking work for the Bellevue Hospital in New York, Neubauer began to work on one of the most vile experiments in his entire career. Attempting to study the differences in twins and triplets, Neubauer oversaw the separation of multiple groups of twins and one set of triplets, overseeing their growth and development into adults. Neubauer never revealed to the twins nor their adoptive parents that they had siblings, and when the twins did learn of this, there was outrage. Numerous biographical stories have been published on this. Several twins also unfortunately took their own lives, and the findings of the study have been sealed by Neubauer within Yale University until 2065. Number 8. Project 4.1. In March 1st, 1954, the Marshall Island region known as Bikini Atoll was subjected to nuclear weapons tests led by the United States government and dubbed Castle Bravo. As a result, fallout was carried eastwards, contaminating 23 members of a Japanese fishing vessel and the entire populations of the Rongelap and Utrik atolls. Instead of taking responsibility, the government organized Project 4.1 with the intent of studying the Marshallese victims. Ultimately, 239 Marshallese people were exposed, as well as 28 Americans who were stationed on one of the atolls. Effects included loss of hair, skin damage, lesions, and extreme development of cancer, as well as miscarriages and stillbirths. The US government has never attempted to give compensation for these actions. Number 7. Burke Burke and hair. 19th and 20th century medical history has had a long and troubled history. As scientists have attempted to better understand the human body, a number of them have taken extreme measures to obtain subjects. One of the more notorious of these involved William Burke and William Hare, two men working out of Edinburgh, Scotland. During a decline in legally supplied cadavers, Hare was lodging a friend who suddenly passed away. Turning to his friend Burke, the two decided to sell the corpse to Robert Knox. As more people lodged at the Hare's house, the two men took the life of a sick woman and sold the body to Knox. They continued their spree until the discovery of Margaret Docherty, their final victim. The two were found guilty and executed, and Knox was exonerated of charges, though whether or not he actually knew how the bodies were retrieved remains an open question. Number 5. The Monster Study. Another disgusting experiment. The Monster Study was headed by Wendell Johnson, a speech pathologist working out of the University of Iowa. Johnson's experiment was performed on 22 orphans with the goal of inducing stuttering within the subjects. Effectively, half of the orphans were given positive encouragement during their speech therapy, while the other half were mocked for their speech even if they didn't stutter to begin with. The staff would lie and pretend that the orphans were showing signs of potentially stuttering. The results? Well, it didn't induce stuttering as Johnson had hoped, and most of the subjects became withdrawn and extremely defensive. Who'd have thunk it?
Number 10. Back pain. We'll kick this list off with a horrific prison deal, okay? Around the early 1970s, a lot of experiments rather, they would involve prisoners. And more often than not, they were considered horrible and inhumane. Congressional hearings in 1973 revealed some shady stuff about these pharmaceutical industry. Officials were actually using prisoners for testing because they were cheaper than chimpanzees at the time. Yeah, they were cheaper than animal testing. That's a loaded sentence. That's all bad right there. Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia specifically, they were a hot one. They did this a lot, sadly. Edward Yusef Anthony, a prisoner at the time who was actually featured in a book about all these horrible studies, he says he agreed to have a layer of skin peeled off of his back, which was then coated with searing chemicals in order to test this pharmaceutical. He did that for money to buy cigarettes in prison. It's terrible. He recalled weeks of intense itching and agonizing pain. I can't even imagine. All while serving time too. That's like the most bad. That's all bad. Number 7, stomach test. Okay, I'll try and keep this list a little bit of a lighter note here. I'll try and bump it up a bit. This one's not as bad, if such a thing exists. Back in 1822, a fur trader in Michigan was accidentally hit in the stomach. But the trader was lucky to be treated by one Dr. William Beaumont. The fur trader survived, which already was a surprise given the, damage. But now they had this opened hole. They had this wound in his stomach that never heals. Now, this once in a lifetime opportunity allowed a good peek at the digestive process. I feel so sick. I had breakfast 14 minutes ago. Awesome. So Dr. Beaumont began conducting experiments. He's like, let's use this horrible situation for science. He wanted to know how the stomach works, so he would tie food to a string and then insert said yum-yums through the hole in the trader's stomach. And then every few hours he would just pop the food out to observe how it had been digested. I feel so sick talking about this. Now that's the grossest thing I've ever heard personally, but these experiments did lead us to a worldwide knowledge that digestion was a chemical and not a mechanical process. So, guy's just stuffing pierogies in homeboy's stomach. He's like, someone ate it. I'm gonna throw up. Number 6, Operation Midnight Climax. Sounds like a funny name, but it's really not funny at all. Back in the 1950s, the CIA launched Operation Midnight Climax, ideally to study the effects of mind-altering substances on individuals. So in San Francisco and New York, subjects who again did not give consent or really know what was happening, they were tricked into participating. They were lured into safe houses by the, ladies of the night, but these women were actually secretly on the CIA's payroll. Yeah, they were calling in. They would work for the CIA secretly. They would give out these mind-altering substances, and then they would secretly watch from behind one-way glass. This was all found out and later thankfully shut down in 1965, and the CIA was busted for 1, blackmail, 2, surveillance technology, and 3, the use of mind-altering substances on the field. Yeah, can't do any of those. Number 5, Bobby, Eddie, and David. When Bobby Shafran was 19 years old, he found out that he had a twin this whole time. He found out he had a brother named Eddie. Now, this is usually fun, but, well, hang on here. The two were raised separately because they had been adopted at birth into different households, of course. But not too long after finding out about each other, things took a crazier turn when Bobby and Eddie found out they had another twin, a triplet rather. another brother named David. So it should have been a very joyous reunion for these triplets turned dark when they began to uncover the truth about what happened and why they'd spent all those years not knowing that each other existed this whole time. They were forced to be subjects in an experiment that they had no idea was taking place their entire lives, just in the background. Peter Neubar was a psychiatrist who wanted to study nature versus nurture, but he decided to do it in a cruel and unethical way. He believed that twins or triplets had a better chance of thriving in life if they were separated from their pair, and they wanted to prove this by unknowingly separating twins from each other at birth. Luckily, Bobby, Eddie, and David all found each other. Their story is documented in the movie The Three Identical Strangers. Number 2. The Pit of Despair. This experiment was conducted by Henry Harlow and is one of the most controversial on this list. Now, in a sort of mental health study, I guess if you want to call it that, Henry decided to induce depression into monkeys. He took very young monkeys and separated them from their peers and their families and their mothers and put them into an isolation cage that was called the Pit of Despair. They even gave it a sad human name, like why? Just call it like the test cage. I don't know, so sad. Sometimes the monkeys would stay there for longer, more extended periods, and other times they would be repeatedly separated and put into the cage for multiple, shorter stays. These monkeys all proved to be extremely psychologically disturbed, of course, after the conclusion of this experiment, which should have seemed kind of obvious even before it started. Now, these monkeys were used as a model of human clinical depression, but here's where things get even sadder, dare I say, than they already were. These monkeys were unable to be treated and then rehabilitated. They just stayed depressed. Despite various forms of treatment, they were just unable to get to a place that they would have been had, they not been subjected to a cruel experiment. Number 9, human-monkey hybrid. Guys, I wish this was fake, but it's not. So scientists, they're currently trying to make human-monkey hybrids, like the title just said. They have high hopes that these experiments will succeed because monkeys and humans are similar genetically. So obviously, we're gonna try a few times. Spanish biologist Juan Carlos Esbizula Belmonte is working with monkey researchers in China right now to perform these experiments. So basically they're mixing human cells into monkey embryos and then they're just gonna see what happens, I guess. I don't know. Hope it goes well. Their objective is to grow a monkey whose organs are completely made of human cells. Doesn't that sound just terrifying when I say it out loud like that? Then they would use said animals and their organs for people that need them. Yeah, of course this is a little bit controversial in a few ways, so let's just keep moving on. Number 7, see-through frogs. Here we go. Just when you thought frogs were already hard to spot, boom, now they're invisible. Good luck catching them. Back in 2016, through artificial insemination, scientists successfully took the DNA of 2 kinds of recessive color frogs, black-eyed frogs and gray-eyed frogs. Then they combined them together to create a frog whose skin is now always translucent. They made an X-Men of a frog. We love it. The see-through factor allows observation of organ growth or cancer formation. That's the human science thing. And it kind of helps when you can see the problem, I guess. No dissection needed for further study. Right? Just looking through you. That's pretty intrusive. I don't know. Imagine being see-through all the time. Like, hey pal, my eyes are up here. Quit staring at my pancreas. Number 6, Tigons. Let Tigons be bygones. Let's never do this, ever, please. I was gonna say liger, but that's been used before. We all know what that one looks like. Tigons were a real hybrid animal that you could see for yourself at both the London Zoo and the Manchester Zoo at one point in history. This was, of course, back in the late 30s, where folks didn't bat an eye towards these kind of projects or these kind of things. Yeah, step on up and see the Tigon. A tiger head and a lion body, and a tiger tail, all together to make a big old pile of holy. Yeah, that's what happens when you put animals in the same cage. Sometimes they get along a little too well. Tigon hybrids were seen long before the 90s as well. In 1837, for example, Queen Victoria was gifted a Tigon. That's odd. They're like flowers or a hybrid creature. What do we give the Queen? Number 5. DIY. Not sure how many times I have to say this in life, but don't try any crossbreeding at home, or ever, for that matter. Thanks. Keep it up. Because things obviously go south. For example, back in 2010, a woman named Julie Leroy, she was working as an animal control officer when an owner of a pit bull puppy said she didn't want to keep her. Okay, this happens often. But when Julie saw the dog, she was in complete disbelief. She was like, yeah, I'll take this living animal. I'm not a monster. I can commit to this for sure. Thanks. People who abandon animals also, you're the devil. Don't do that. This dog, it was a hybrid animal. It wasn't healthy, but all the more reasons why you should stick around. The dog had a squished up body, a huge jaw, and a bad underbite, and it was oddly shaped. But you gotta love him still. Look, he's so cute. God, I want him. Little bread dude. That's because the dog suffered from short spine syndrome. That's because they got the dog from a backyard breeding place who was carelessly breeding a bunch of these dogs together. Just no effort at all. No care. Thankfully, Julie did bring the dog home and gave her a loving time. Sweet little thing. Olivia and I want a dog so badly. I would definitely take this little hybrid lady in a heartbeat, for sure. A little bread bed for her. Oh, I love dogs, even if they're, you know, hybrid and created in a backyard. Number 4, glowfish. I never had a fish tank growing up. I don't know, not sure how I felt about a starfish just watching me sleep for hours on end. Back in 2012, Yorktown Technologies created hybrid glowfish. They were first created from zebrafish, but now there's a whole plethora of glowfish that you can purchase. Tiger barbs, rainbow sharks, you name it, everything is glowy now. I guess to hype up Avatar 2, I don't know. I don't see why we needed hybrid glowfish. Why are we doing this? Can we stop? Bioluminescence is natural. We see octopus or deep sea fish that have it naturally. Scientists in Singapore were originally aiming to modify fish to spot toxins in polluted water in an easier way. Cool. But on one hand, you're like, oh, these fish are pretty beautiful. They're glowy. Can I have one, please? Alan Blake, co-founder of said Yorktown Technologies, wanted them to glow only when near toxins. Now, this was back in 2003 when they first started. Guy wanted real-life notifications in the water. Cool. Today, we're at a point where glowfish are just being sold to houses for reasons. Just because. Do you want a glowfish? I don't know. Am I the only one that's like out of the loop with like the glowy fish vibe? Comment down below if a glowfish is something you want or now want. Oops, sorry. Number 3, savanna cats. This one's been talked about for a while now. How do we feel about savanna cats? I want to hear about this one as well. In May 2012, the International Cat Association registered this savanna cat as a new breed. It's official. We got a new cat. Just what the world needs. More cats. I'm allergic, so, you know, pardon my beef. The international cat community confirms it. Now, it all started in the late 80s when Judy Frank crossbred a male several with a domestic Siamese. The offspring, in turn, was appropriately named Savannah. Yeah, now we have cats with big ass ears, and they're so cute. I can't help it, they are so cute. Domestic cats mixed with wild African cats. I mean, it sounds like you're gonna get a cat. I don't know how to tell you. This is like a science experiment that they're like, oh, it worked. And apparently they're great. Apparently they're not too crazy temper-wise, but they're fun and they're energetic. Great for families. Who knew? Better than glowfish. Any day. Any day. Number 2, pig human. Scientists at the Salk Institute for Biological Scientists, what a mouthful that was, have created a human-pig hybrid. Yeah, in 2017, when worlds collide, let's do it. An embryo was placed in an adult pig for 4 weeks, and then when it was taken out and further analyzed, the embryos, not only one survived, but they also contained some human cells. So their hope now was to grow human organs inside of pigs, instead of, waiting for a donor. Impatient, but okay, we're listening. In 1910, zoologists figured out that it might even be possible to create hybrids between humans and their closest relatives as well. Yeah, no matter how this ends, either Planet of the Apes or Planet of the Pigs, I did my part, okay? I recycled. I didn't with animal DNA, like Jurassic Park. I just kinda got a job. I don't know. Hands are clean. And finally, number 1, Stubbins Firth. We saved Firth for first. Let's do it. This is one of the craziest science projects I've ever heard of, so buckle up. Stubbins Firth, a researcher from Pennsylvania back in the late 1700s. First of all, as you could probably guess, methods back in the 1700s were often messy and pretty much illegal in every way. Firth was a doctor in training at the time, and he decided to prove to the world that yellow fever was not contagious. Yeah, imagine if you had Twitter. Firth would surgically insert vomit from his patients with yellow fever. He would insert vomit into his body. He would insert all their yuck into his wounds, all over his face, his eyes, you name it. He was trying to get it. He was going the extra, I'm gonna throw up. He was going the extra mile, all in the name of medical research. Even urine and saliva too. Anything yucky, he was rubbing it in. Firth, to all of our surprise, did not get sick. He was proud of that one. He told everybody the news loudly. He mansplained it at like 4 a.m. We look back now though and we realize Firth just sampled late stage patients, so they were further along. Much further, say, than the contagious period. So basically he volunteered to dump all the on his Yeah, science. History is gross. Science as well. Gets a little messy sometimes. Number 10, monkey head transplant. Okay, right off the top, here we go. Pun intended. The first ever successful monkey head transplant was back in the early 1970s. I imagine some of your parents may have heard about this. It's probably pretty hard to forget. Maybe ask them about it tonight while they're mid-bite at dinner. American researcher Robert White pulled off the otherwise impossible in a slow, tedious operation. White took the head of one monkey and then attached it to a headless monkey. Yeah, add a little time and energy and voila. voila, this actually worked. Yeah, believe it or not, the monkey actually tried to bite one of the surgeons once it came to, which, I mean, totally fair. I'd be a little pissed off too if I just had a different body all of a sudden. Sadly, the monkey passed away 9 days later, which is much further than I ever thought. But the fact that this actually happened is 1, terrifying, and 2, dare I say, miraculous. This is some sci-fi stuff right here. And here you go, new head, enjoy. Number 9, monkey become human. Okay, this next test here is a little less hands-on, so if you have some food, you could probably take a bite during this one. It's safe. Back in 1931, psychologist Winthrop Kellogg, familiar name, he was curious. Yeah, he sat up one night out of the blue and thought, what would happen if a monkey was raised with humans? Yeah, would it end up like that monkey from MVP, Most Valuable Primate? Would it learn to play hockey for the local team? Or would it learn how to do kickflips with Tony Hawk? No, none of that happened. Surprise, surprise. Kellogg brought a baby female chimp named Gua into his home, and this man raised a chimp as if it were another human being alongside his own son, human son, Donald. Yeah, they played, they laughed, they did everything together, but the test ended abruptly after Kellogg's son, Donald, started to make chimp noises. Yeah, and then everyone was like, you know what? I'm good, let's cancel this. Maybe chimps can't learn how to heel flip. We're done, let's go home. So Gua was then released. There we go. No more human best friend, you know? Back to normal, dare I say, normal? Number 8, feel the music. Okay, this next one here is a little fun, and we're on a part 3, and I have to talk about it. I just have to talk about it. There are many odd experiments in history where humans should have left, human elements out, like music and illicit substances. I can't say what I want to say, but it's white, it's fluffy. It's a bad substance that's white and fluffy. There you go, that's all I'll say. YouTube's like, what is he saying? I can't figure it out. There you go, only you and I know. We're too smart for the algorithm. Well, back in 2011, a study was done where rats, just a bunch of rats, were all put in a room, and on loop, they played a Miles Davis song. So they were all on said illicit substance, right? That stuff, and they were in a room while Miles Davis played all day long. Just smooth jazz all day. I'm not laughing because it's funny, it's the weirdest thing. Imagine walking into this room by accident, you're like, what's going on in here? Oh my god, everyone's all hopped up. Well, before the substances were injected into the test subjects, they all seemed to have calm demeanors while Beethoven played on loop. But after injected, all the rats were neurologically triggered to that smooth jazz. Yeah, after 1 week on the sauce, the rats were all of a sudden like, you know what? Miles Davis kind of slaps. Been sleeping on Miles Davis this whole time. They're all like, yeah, Miles Davis, really good, so good. Horrible animal research and taxpayers' money. Yeah, we love dark history here on Most Amazing Top 10. Number 7, the first pregnancy test. If you're looking past the ancient Egyptian times and their use of barley and urine to determine if somebody is pregnant, you'll often land on this experiment from the 1930s. Now, it was developed in 1931 by Dr. Maurice Friedman at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School. Now, what would happen is doctors would inject a rabbit with urine from a woman who was suspected of being pregnant, and the rabbit's ovaries could easily tell if that was the case. Accurate test? Yeah. Historical? Of course, it changed the game. Would it also end up with the rabbits passing away? Sadly, also a third yes. It's sad, but more often than not, when humans are involved with any medical process, the test subject dies. Before having its head transferred to another animal or something, you're like, what the f is happening here? Number 6, small brain and big brain. This next one here, again, we're on a part 3. We're getting into some f***ed up stuff. Here we go. In the early 19th century, humans were figuring out a lot of firsts, especially German researcher Karl August Weinhold. He was on the quest to prove to all that the brain and its nervous system were both attached by wires. Yeah, in order to do so, he took brains and spinal cords of deceased cats, and he filled the cavities inside with zinc and silver batteries. And like we know now, the obvious happened. The bodies began to reanimate as if they were alive again. It's like it's black magic. Or batteries, probably batteries. It's definitely the batteries. This was the first time this type of test was done, and now we use electricity and silver for other ways, of course. But thanks to this curious doctor, the early 19th century saw some early Bill Nye the Gross Science Guy stuff. Again, imagine walking into this room by accident, like, ho, what's going on in here now? Number 5, the multi-dog. Ah, nice, I love dogs. Let's get a bunch for the price of none. Back in the 50s, when a Soviet scientist, Vladimir Demikov, created a multi-dog, Time magazine had to cover it. Of course, this is a feat in science. As cruel as it sounds, of course, the adult dog had a newborn grafted to its neck. It's impressive, but also you're like, ew, my God, Jesus. So when it grew, it could survive off the blood of the main, bigger dog. The body, for lack of a better term, gross. When observed, the puppy did have its own characteristics, which was the craziest point here. Some say it was playful with its growls, just as the other dog's characteristics would be. It's a sad 1950s Soviet animal experiment, so of course the animal didn't survive for a long time. It just, all of a sudden it was on something's neck and then it was in the next life. That's horrible. Number 4, the great razor auk. Once thriving in colonies off North Atlantic coast, the great auk would grow to 30 inches long and its wings would only be used to swim. They were little cute tiny boys. They were cute but quite defenseless, obviously, since they're not here anymore. Around the 1500s, European fishermen discovered this perfect area for hunting, and it just happened to be where most of these great auks were all living. Yeah, Newfoundland. Go get screeched in and then take out 1,000 auks. There we go. It was packed, so they rapidly declined. And by 1950, the last 2 known specimens were hunted by a single fisherman on LD Island. What a But now, scientists plan on using genetic information extracted from their fossils or preserved organs, people how they have, birds in jars and stuff like that. They plan on editing their DNA into the closest living species, which is now the razor-billed auk. So yeah, the organization Revive and Restore may bring these birds back to life. So cute flappy wings may just return. Remember that game Flappy Wings? Disappeared from the App Store so quick. Disappeared faster than number 3, the dodo bird. Dodo birds were once big and beautiful. These flightless ground nesting birds once filled islands all over the Indian Ocean. They had massive talons, they were gray and blue, they didn't have any natural predator, until, we came along. Sorry, we got hungry. Around 1507, the island was discovered by Portuguese sailors and the rest is history. They were the easiest bird to hunt, hence the phrase, dead as a dodo. That's where it comes from. They weren't just loved by sailors either. No, monkeys, rats, pigs, any animal that made its way to the island easily had their eggs for lunch. And reminder, they were big eggs. So it didn't take a long time for the dodo bird population to be completely wiped out. The last dodo was hunted in 1681. Again, imagine being that guy. What a dick. But could it be? Could we bring the dodo back to life with science? Yes, apparently. This could be a real thing. Scientists found an extremely well-preserved dodo skeleton back in 2007, so we may have a chance at picking some DNA apart. A research facility near Melbourne, Australia is currently trying to use pigeon genes, and we're gonna see them in the sky. I mean, I'm all for the idea of bringing back, animals and stuff. Scientifically, that's a wonderful feat, but do we really think no one's gonna make dodo bird chicken wings? I'm gonna get that on Uber Eats in a year. I can just smell it. Number 2, the gastric brooding frog. Crossbreeding and gastric brooding. Nice, we're getting close to the end, it seems. I'm a big fan of frogs, and the gastric brooding frog is particularly interesting to me and also scientists due to their birthing process. If you're eating something, now would be a good time to hit that thumbs up, maybe take a break, put that food to the side for a bit. See, these frogs back, and when they were alive, they would swallow their eggs and then they would hatch them later out of their mouths. Pretty horrible if you watch that in time lapse, I bet. They're fascinating creatures. And with the Lazarus Project, scientists are actually trying to bring back the Australian gastric brooding frog from extinction. So we might see this horrible act in person. You might go to catch a frog and then all of a sudden it'll be like, wah, and then a baby will come out of it and you'll be like, all right, I'm all set actually, how about that? They went extinct back in 1983, but scientists have figured out how to implant dead cells into a fresh egg from an entirely different frog species. Amphibians are declining worldwide, so if we can get these guys back out of extinction, it would be 1 point for Gryffindor. We'd be looking a lot better, that's all I'm saying. And finally, number 1, Martha. Look, I like to keep it light, so I have to end with my girl Martha. The passenger pigeon once flocked over the skies of Canada. This was the 19th century, and it looked a lot different. Billions of these bright orange birds would just paint the skies, and rumor has it, they would fly in flocks so large that it would block the sun out for a short amount of time. Wow. Hashtag flocks that block. We love it. But only a few decades passed and the passenger pigeon, they're gone. Just like that. They're no more. So what exactly happened? Well, the very last passenger pigeon, her name was Martha. She sadly passed away in the Cincinnati Zoo in 1914. So we took a look at her DNA to see if Martha held any secrets to her past and their extinction, and we found a couple. They discovered Martha had a low genetic diversity for such a growing population. Natural selection and hunting eliminated the nicest looking pigeon, arguably. The last one died in 1914, but in 2019, paleontologists found remains of the pigeon in protected indigenous lands in the Northwest Territories. So now they blended passenger pigeon DNA with dinosaur DNA, so that's always exciting. We've seen a few movies on how that can go wrong. We're bringing back pigeons with a touch of dinosaur. I'll say it again, on one hand, I'm glad science is allowing us to, try again, have another go. But look at the pigeons we have now. Those pigeons are hardcore. These things will walk onto the subway with you. Pigeons today will ask you for change. They're ruthless. They're covered in mustard. It's not the same. These graceful birds from the 1910s, I feel like we're bringing back Captain America. You know what I mean? I don't think these old school chaps will appreciate the new game of pigeons. They're a little dirty. I don't know. I don't think they're ready, and I don't think we are either. Number 7, the Zorse. The Zorse. Yes, the male zebra, female horse. Now we get a really fun word. Zorse. The Zorse. Sorry. It sounds like a god. Yeah, there's Thor, Odin, and then Zorse. Zebroids, that's their scientific name, they're usually quite common historically. Charles Darwin even noted some in his work. So since the 19th century, crossbreeding zebras with horses, donkeys, you name it, has been done. More often than not, and this is what makes them stand out, zebroids will experience dwarfism. So they're very little petite little guys. In 2010, a zedonk was born. It was a zebra donkey, but again, back in the 70s, this happened before, and no one really talked about it. There were 3 born in Colchester Zoo. Yeah, those zookeepers were like, how do we make zoos new and hip? Bizarre. Humans are so weird. They're not too smart, humans. They're like, yeah, let's put these in a cage. It'll be fine. Number 6, bees. I hate bees so much. When the window's closed, we're good. Remember when we had to worry about killer bees for a couple months, like a year ago? During an already dark time? Should we still be worried? Are these killer bees coming back? Are they a real thing? Hybrid bees? Those are also, Will hybrid bees fight the killer bees? Can we watch this? Can we tune in and watch this on Triller? An experiment in the 70s tried to change the hashtag bee game, and in turn, we got a brand new bee. Yeah, we love those. Just new bees to dodge outside. The idea at first was to take a regular honeybee and then breed it with an African honeybee. Ideally, we would get a hybrid bee that can safely provide more honey than a regular honeybee. Okay, that's steps. We're going towards the future with this one, right? On paper. The experiment obviously didn't work with these new bees, and they didn't do that at all. And worst part of all, the bees got out. Yeah, imagine that email. To whom it may concern. Oh God, I left the door open, I'm sorry. These bees are aggressive towards other kinds of bees. They're not too nice, they're not too friendly, and they're very aggressive towards humans as well, in case you were wondering. And when these bees sting, their stinger stays with them afterwards, so they can continue stinging multiple times with their stinger butts. Yeah, they don't fall off, right? That's our only hope when we see a bee the size of a tennis ball. We're like, he won't, will he? Will he? I don't think. These bees would. Because they can. Yeah, hybrid killer bees. Victims have received 10 times the amount of stings as regular swarms. It's a lot of stings. It's a lot of movements from the bee's hips there. That's like some Caesar. That's like the Julius Caesar numbers right there. That's crazy. They react to disturbances 10 times faster, and they will also chase said disturbance a quarter of a mile to find it. So yeah, don't sneeze. These bees have caused over 1,000 deaths, so yeah, I guess we should worry. We should definitely worry. Hit that thumbs up just because we're like, no, there's no good in this. That's scary. That's so scary. Hit that thumbs up for bee progression. Let's save the bees. Hit the thumbs up for the bees. Let's save all the bees except for those kind. The other ones are good. Number 5, Tigons. Tigons be bygones. Haha. He's good. I was gonna say liger, but that's been used before. We know what that one looks like. Tigons were a real hybrid animal you could see for yourself at both the London Zoo and the Manchester Zoo once upon a time. This was of course back in the late 30s where folks didn't, bat an eye towards these kind of things with animals. Yeah, step on up and see the Tigon. A tiger head, a lion body, and a tiger tail. That's what happens when you put animals in the same cage. Come on out. Well, sometimes they'll get along too well in said cage, and then you'll get a Tigon. Tigon hybrids were seen long before the 90s. Actually, in 1837, Queen Victoria was gifted a Tigon. Imagine that. I wouldn't know what to do with that. I'd be like, hi, what are you? Number 4, Hiramitsu Nakachi. Stem cell biologist from Tokyo. This one is insane. Now we're getting to the dark ones here. Just recently, his experiments have been approved by the government, so things are actively in play here, not just, Farmer Joe in the early 1900s. No, this is modern science. This is some Black Mirror type stuff here. Hiramitsu hopes to grow human cells inside of mice and rats, and then transplant said embryos into surrogate animals. A lot of animals, a lot of cells, a lot of traffic, a lot of moving around, and a lot of science, apparently. Cells into rats and mice embryos. How did we even get here? Who thought of this first? We went from the Salem witch trials to rodents being genetically manipulated so they can make pancreases for themselves. I like the word pancreas. I've been using it a few times lately. But his hope was that the rodent bodies would use the human cells to then make a pancreas for themselves. Here's the thing though, while conducting said experiments, they found that the rats were starting to develop a human type brain. That's when they pulled the plug on that entire project. Yeah, the second humans and animals get too close, governments will come in and go, stop. Number 3, Beefalo. Beefalo sounds like a Pokemon. It sounds like a thing that's close to being real but shouldn't be, and that's where it should have stayed, if I'm being honest. The Beefalo should have only been a concept. But then a guy named Charles Buffalo Jones did the impossible. Look at him go. One day in 1906, he said, "Hey, watch this," and then started breeding Arizona bison with domestic cattle in order to produce a hardy commercial animal, just something new to make some money. He ended up giving up on this project entirely, and then he just released the animals. Yeah, guy just got bored and released science projects to the wilds. What could go wrong? The beefalo then found their way into a national park where hunting was banned, so they thrived. And they thrived without natural predators at that. The population began to grow by 50% every single year, and at first you're like, wow, we did it. This is like Jurassic Park, but cute. No, their environmental impact was horrible. It was not ideal. They played God. They messed with the circle of life. You eat one bug, then there's a hurricane somewhere else. First off, these guys are very thirsty animals. They can consume 10 gallons of water each trip to a watering hole. They're like that one kid growing up drinking at the water fountain. You're like, guy, save some. Please hurry. I'm so thirsty. Yeah, they drank all the water. Every animal was so thirsty after. They also in said water, so they ruined the entire water park for every other animal involved. Yeah, all bad. Entire ecosystems were messed up at this point. Everybody got thirsty because Charles Buffalo Jones was like, hey, watch this. Let's try something new. Number 2, don't try this at home. Not sure how many times I have to say this, but don't try any crossbreeding at home. Or ever, for that matter. Because things go south, obviously. For example, back in 2010, a woman named Julie Leroy was working as an animal control officer when an owner of a pit bull puppy said that she didn't want to keep her. This is normal. Maybe a kid will come into the picture, maybe the dog's too aggressive, whatever, and then they have to give it back. Okay. When Julie saw the dog, she was in shock. She was like, yeah, I'll take this living animal, first of all. I'm not a monster, thank you, I can do this. People who abandon animals, also, they're the devil. Side note. This dog was different, but it wasn't mean. It was just a hybrid. It wasn't healthy, but all the more reason why you should stick around. Know what I mean? The dog had a squished body, it had a huge jaw, and a bad underbite, and it was oddly shaped. That's because the dog suffered from short spine syndrome. That's because they got the dog from this backyard breeder who was carelessly breeding a bunch of dogs together, just for fun, not really knowing what he's doing. Thankfully, Julie did know what she was doing. She brought the dog home and gave her a loving home. Sweet little thing. Olivia and I want a dog so badly, so you know what? We'll take this hybrid little lady anytime. Her name's Kuda. She's in great hands, but look at her, she's so cute. And finally, number 1, lions. Back in the 80s, the Chatbar Zoo in Chandigarh, India, they tried this fun little science experiment for themselves. Yeah, they tried an experimental program rather, where they would breed together domestic lions, little petite, well, small in terms of a lion. They would mix them with these massive, beastly African lions in the hopes that they would meet in the middle somewhere and be introduced to the wild and help with the dying population of wild lions in India. Again, on paper, we wanted to get involved, we want to help restructure the lives of this animal, but the zoo found 2 African lions that were being used in a circus and then brought them in to breed with their 2 Asiatic lions. And it didn't. Obviously, it's number 1, it didn't work. When the cubs were born, it was clear that this was already a mistake. The cubs had weak back legs, they were having extreme trouble walking, and as they got older, their immune systems just started to fail faster and faster. By 2000, they'd bred more than 70 of these hybrid lions. That's a lot of projects, a lot of experiments. So they finally decided to stop the program, thankfully, and all the males were given vasectomies in order to stop any further reproduction, which is so odd to me. Like, I'm not a fan of humans at all at this point. They're like, hey, welcome to Earth. Yeah, it kind of sucks, right? It's hot. Okay, cool, we're gonna stop making you now. Cheers. What? Naturally, thankfully, there are laws that prohibit officials from just killing these animals, so now they're just simply waiting for them to die naturally, which is, it's better. It's certainly better, but still, stop messing with nature, guys. How many times do I have to tell you? Stop messing with nature.